Good mid-afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Mid-Afternoon Masterclass as part of the University of Melbourne Science Festival, a part of National Science Week. My name is Julia and I will be your host today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all zooming in from today. For me, I am on Wurundjeri land today, which is also lands of where a lot of the university work is also undertaken. So I want to pay my respects to elders of these lands, past and present, and also emerging, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people in the audience today. Really importantly as well, at this time of National Science Week, I also really want to acknowledge and respect that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first scientists of this land. They've been researching and learning and caring for this land for tens of thousands of years, and they have a deep and enduring knowledge of the land, waters and skies. So, Mid-Afternoon Masterclass. This is a series of events actually happening at 2 o'clock every day this week, where we're going to hear directly from Melbourne Uni academics, working on fascinating, interesting topics from a variety of different disciplines. So each session will include a short presentation from the academic, and then there'll also be some time for Q&A as well. Today, as you all know, it is Dating Australia's Rock Art. So we are going to hear about different scientific techniques being used to date Australia's rock art, and the importance of integrating traditional knowledges and Western science. And to talk on this topic, without further ado, she's been on your screen the entire time. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Helen Green, who is going to be our speaker today. She's a geochemist and she's from the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Hi, Helen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we go on, I would love, I will throw over to you in a moment with your presentation, but I know we have a number of school students and a number of different people from all walks of life, and I think it'd be wonderful to hear a bit of background from you. So what started your interest in science, and I guess what's a little bit of a snapshot of your journey up into your research and what you're doing today?
Well, I'm originally from the UK, and when I was at school, I used to really enjoy biology, chemistry and physics, but I also really liked doing things that were outside. So when I was a high school student, I was looking for a degree that involved applying science to stuff that would involve both lab work and field work, and would allow me to do things outside in nature. And geology seemed to be a really good fit for that. And so I did my undergraduate degree in the UK at Durham University in geology, and then I moved to Australia in 2009 and did my PhD here at the university in the then School of Earth Sciences, applying uranium thorium dating to stalagmites in caves. I was then lucky enough that as my PhD was finishing up and I was graduating, this opportunity to work on the Kimberley rock art dating project became apparent to me, and I was lucky enough to get the job, and I've worked on this project since 2014, and it really is everything that I dreamed of when I was a school student, that I get to do science in a lab and at the university, but I also get to go up to the Kimberley and work out in the field and out in the bush. So it's my dream job, and I feel very fortunate.
Oh, that's so wonderful. It's so nice to hear, and to have that balance, I think, is fantastic. And I'm very envious of you being able to go up to the amazing lands of the Kimberleys. It's I've been up north once or twice, and it's just a most incredible place. So I can't wait to hear more about it. Before I do throw over to you, I just wanted, I guess, you and everyone in Zoom land to know a few things. So I guess this is the housekeeping part. So as you all know, we're on Zoom, and this is also a Zoom webinar, so we can't hear or see you. But there are two ways that you can interact and engage with us. We'd love you to do so. So the first one is the chat function down the bottom. So if no one's used Zoom before, there's sort of a bar down the bottom. You sort of toggle your mouse. You can click on the chat function, and so that's there for you to make any comments throughout the presentation if you'd like to. And yeah, that's one way of interacting. And I think as a bit of a test, and also for Helen and I, just to find out a little bit more about all you out there in Zoom land, it's one thing that we miss out on, is actually seeing the audience that we're talking to. So as a test, if everyone can open up their chat function. Also make sure that near the chat it says you can sort of have a drop down menu and you can either choose all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if you can click all panelists and attendees and just let us know where you are zooming in from, whether that's the suburb you're in, the school you're from, the organisation you're working from, the state, the country. Let us know where you're zooming in from so we can have a bit of an idea. Fantry Gully, Geelong West, Scoresby, wonderful, Melbourne, Sunbury, Southwest Victoria, Macedon Regis. Oh, there's so many people. Brunswick, wonderful. Bacchus Marsh, Ivanhoe, Mornington Peninsula, beautiful. Sunbury, Orangeryland as well, Lara, wonderful. Sydney, hello Sydney. Lots of different people, Brunswick. Sunny Seaford, India, fantastic. Lovely to see some international people as well. Melbourne, Rockford Christian College, China as well, lovely. Okay, well, it's really exciting to hear, and this, I guess, one of the major benefits of being able to do these presentations online is that anyone from around the world will be able to tune in. So welcome, everyone. Now, the second thing I did want to mention is the Q&A function. So just next to the chat function, there's also a Q&A button. So if throughout Helen's presentation, there's a question you'd like to ask, we will be able to get to as many questions as possible at the end of her presentation. So as soon as a question pops up, put it into the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. So that's the two things. And now I'm done. And now I can sit back and enjoy the presentation. So Helen, thank you so much for joining us again. I will hand over to you to give us an insight into all your work, which we are all very, very keen to hear about. Fantastic. And yes, and your presentation is underway. Yep, looks great. All right, great. Thank you. I'll be back at the end of the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Helen Green, and I am a research fellow in rock art dating in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and the land on which I'm lucky enough to work in the Kimberley, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And today I'm going to give a broad overview of the Kimberley Rock Art Dating Project. So this is an Australian Research Council linkage project based here at the University of Melbourne and linked with Rock Art Australia, as well as a number of other partners from universities and corporations across the country. I'm going to talk about the art, of course, and how we're using different scientific techniques to date it, as well as some of the really exciting results that have been published from this project so far. So in the image on the screen there, you can see traditional owner Ian Wayner, and he's looking at a regular infill animal kangaroo painting. And we'll come back to this painting and paintings in this shelter a bit later on in the presentation. So just keep that in mind. So what is rock art? Rock art is human-made markings placed on natural surfaces, and a lot of surviving rock art is found in caves or partly enclosed rock shelters where it's protected from the elements, allowing it to survive as long as it has done. Rock art is a global phenomenon, and this map shows just some of the art sites found in many culturally diverse regions of the world. You can see there's some UNESCO sites, the green stars, the sites where other rock art dating projects are going on. So there's a lot of activity in rock art research. And in every region, the rock art is different. So perhaps it shows the different animals from those areas or human figures in ceremonial scenes. Some rock art consists of symbols, but there are some similarities seen across the world with, for example, hand stencils found both here in Australia and also in Europe and Indonesia, and they look quite similar, as you can see. The term rock art also includes petroglyphs, which are carved or scratched into the rock surface, sculpted rocks, stone arrangements, bark paintings, but today we're going to focus on rock art paintings. And so rock art researchers are often in search of the oldest rock art in the world. It's the title everybody seems to want to have. And this title is currently held by Maltreviso Cave in northern Spain, where a ladder-like figure, which you can see in the top left-hand image there, has been dated using a method called uranium thorium dating to older than 64,000 years old. And this was particularly exciting because it opened up the possibility that Neanderthals were Earth's first cave painters. Elsewhere in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, the oldest hunting scene in the world has been dated using the same method to older than 44,000 years. And then when you can't get the oldest art in the world, another title that was gained earlier this year was the oldest depiction of an animal in rock art, which was also in Sulawesi, and also used that uranium thorium technique, and just pipped that hunting scene to the post at older than 45.5 thousand years old. And as you can see, at least in those top two figures there, there's this sort of white mineral coating that's over the top of parts of the painting, and we call this cave popcorn. And it's actually that material that the scientists have dated, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on, how uranium thorium is applied to those materials. But most importantly to us, also earlier this year, in February of 2021, my colleague, Dr. Damien Finch, led our research team in a study that used radiocarbon dating to date this life-size kangaroo. It's about 2 meters long, and that was on the ceiling of that shelter above Ian's head in that opening slide, in the Kimberley in northwest Australia. And the dates that Damien achieved on this painting have put this as the oldest in situ painted rock art in Australia. Interestingly, what you can see here is that there is a similarity between the depictions in Indonesia and Australia, but at the moment these paintings are actually very different ages, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. And there's that kangaroo. It was not quite so clear without the overlay there. So how do we date rock art? Well, in many cases we use something called radiometric dating. And this is a method of dating something based on the presence of a radioactive isotope within it. So radioactive isotopes are unstable, and they're trying to become stable all the time. So they do this by giving off radiation, and in doing so they decay or turn into other isotopes or elements until they are stable. The time that it takes for this to happen is called the half-life, and the half-life is how long it takes for the quantity to fall to half its original value. So if you take a sample and at the beginning it had 100 radioactive isotopes, there's only 50 after one half-life, 25 after two half-lives, and so on until it's not radioactive anymore. And because we know the half-lives of isotopes on Earth, we can use these to work out how old something is. We can measure the amount of radioactive isotopes left in a sample relative to a known quantity. And that known quantity might be a known ratio of radioactive isotopes to a stable isotope. And we can use this to work out the age. You can think of it a bit like an hourglass. So if you have an isotope like uranium at the top and thorium at the bottom of the hourglass, and we know how long it takes for uranium to decay to thorium, if we take a sample and we measure the amount of uranium left and the amount of thorium that's accumulated, we can say how old that sample is. And so there are several radiometric techniques that we can use on different materials in different settings. And there are 4 particular techniques that we've used in our research project in the Kimberley, and they're listed here alongside the time periods that they can be used for. Having multiple techniques is particularly useful in rock art research because it gives us options. So it widens the scope of whether it's possible to date the rock art based on the materials that might be available at any given site. And different techniques, as you can see, cover different time spans. So where radiocarbon dating might only reliably stretch back to, say, 55,000 years, other techniques can push that date out a little bit further. It also importantly allows us to cross-check the results of one method against another, which is obviously very valuable. So I'm going to explain these methods very briefly today, and then I'm going to focus on radiocarbon dating, which is the method that's given us the first published and really exciting dates in our project, and dated that kangaroo that we saw on the second slide to be the oldest painted art in Australia. So if we start with cosmogenic nuclei dating, this is a technique that's based on the bombardment of surface rocks with high energy cosmic rays. So in our dating project, this is a technique that we use at the largest scale of dating. So it tells us when the rock shelters that the art was painted in were formed. And this gives us some constraint on the age of the art, because we know that a painting can't be older than the wall that it was painted on. So very simply, this technique works like this. So here's our rock shelter on the left-hand side, and above it, cosmic rays are constantly bombarding the Earth and hitting these rocks here. But this slab underneath is shielded or protected from those cosmic rays because they don't penetrate deep into the Earth's surface. That is until it falls and becomes exposed. So these shelters are continually being eroded away, and when that slab becomes too heavy to stay up there, it will fall down and fall out to be exposed to those cosmic rays. Once exposed, the absorption of these rays generate what we call cosmogenic isotopes, and these accumulate in the rocks at a known rate. So we can measure these isotopes, and that will tell us how long that slab has been exposed for, when did it fall down. And importantly then, if there's art on that back wall or on that ceiling where that slab previously was, we know that that art has to be younger than the age of the fall. It gives us a minimum age constraint. And so on the right-hand side here, you can see a real-life example of this in the Kimberley up on the coast at Freshwater Cove on Dambi-Mangari country. There's Damien there back in 2015 when we were fresh to this project. And you can see that slab that's fallen out there, and on the roof there's very faintly painted rock painting. So if we can date when that slab fell, we know that that rock painting has to be younger. Uranium thorium dating is another dating technique that we use, and this is also used to date rocks in the art shelter. And this technique works on the principle that the element uranium is highly soluble in water. So all natural water contains a very low level amount of uranium in parts per million. So it's not dangerous to us, but it's picked up from the surrounding environment. Importantly for the dating technique, it's also worth noting that thorium is insoluble in water. So the water contains uranium, but contains no thorium. Inside caves or on the walls of these rock shelters, rainwater carrying uranium washes in over the rock surfaces. And as that water dries, minerals such as calcite precipitate out as the water evaporates away, and that traps the uranium in the crystal structure of those minerals. Uranium then radioactively decays to that other element, thorium, that wasn't there at the beginning. And because we know how long that decay takes, if we measure the amount of uranium left and the amount of thorium accumulated in any layer, we can work out how long ago that mineral was deposited or how old it is. So again, it's that hourglass with uranium at the top and thorium at the bottom. And so if in between the deposition of these layers, somebody has come along and painted on that nice fresh mineral surface, we can then take a sample from here of this accretion, and we would expect that ages 1 and 2 from those lower layers below the painting will be older, whilst age 3 from the layer that's formed over the top of the painting will be younger. And that provides a nice bracket around when this painting was done. And that's the technique that's been used to date those images that we saw in the second slide. So the oldest rock art in the world, the oldest hunting scene, the oldest animal have all been dated by uranium thorium dating of those calcite accretions that have formed over or under the painting. And here's an example from the Kimberley. Unfortunately, in the Kimberley, it's not quite so simple because the mineral that's forming from those waters isn't calcite, which makes the whole process a little bit more difficult to understand, but we are in the process of doing that. And so you can see here that there's a painting on this wall that's been quite heavily covered by a mineral accretion. And here is the accretion over the top of that feather coming off a headdress. And so we removed that sample thinking it was over art, but when we actually got it back to the lab and cross-sectioned it and looked at it in cross-section, we could see that the pigment is actually encapsulated between different layers of mineral accretion. So just like in the cartoon, if we can date the mineral accretion under the pigment and we can date the mineral accretion over the pigment, we can say when this painting was likely to have been done. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, or OSL dating, which is much easier to say, is used to work out how long ago a grain of sand or mud was last exposed to sunlight. So simply, you can think of this a bit like a battery. So if a grain of sand is buried or buried in the dark, if sand and mud have built up over a grain of sand, and it starts to accumulate electrons or charge. But once exposed to sunlight, these electrons are evicted and the charge drains down to 0. In the context of rock art dating, if an animal or insect digs up some of the sand and uses this to build a nest, that charge in that grain of sand then drains to 0 as the grain is exposed to sunlight. So the wasp digs up the sand, it carries it to its nest site, and that sand is exposed to sunlight and the electrons are evicted. That grain is then buried deep in the nest and the charge starts to build up again. And because we know how long this takes, we can work out when that grain was last exposed to the sun. And if the nest is built over rock art, we know that the art has to be older than the age of the nest. So here's another example of a site in the Kimberley. This is a very faded panel of these nice little flying foxes. So their heads are down here, their feet are at the top there, and you can see there's 2 nests up here, 2 large nests. That we know if we date these nests, the art has to be older than the age that we get. The difficulty with this technique is that the nests must be collected from the shelter walls at night and analysed in the laboratory under darkroom conditions. So we've spent many evenings out in the Kimberley in a swag at a rock art shelter collecting these nests under darkness, and they then have to be carried back from the Kimberley to the lab without exposing them to sunlight, where they're then analysed under darkroom conditions. Perhaps a more difficult aspect of this technique is that it also requires the nests to be quite big, because none of those sand grains can have been exposed to sunlight in the process of weathering or erosion of those nests over long periods of time. And so it's quite rare to find a big nest that's survived for 10 or 20,000 of years, and that's also in relation to rock art. But where we do, it's a very useful technique, and it's one that was used to produce some of the first dates for Kimberley rock art back in the late 90s. Finally, radiocarbon dating is best used on living things. So this is a technique that involves looking at the ratio of 2 different types of carbon atom in a once living organism to work out when that organism died. So of the 2 different types of carbon atoms, one is stable, so that's carbon-12, and one isn't. We call the unstable carbon atom carbon-14, and this is radioactive. The important thing to remember here is that every living thing is made of carbon. So plants grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, animals eat plants, we eat animals, so we all have carbon in our bodies. This means that once an animal or plant dies and stops taking in that carbon, the stable carbon-12 remains the same, that doesn't change, but the radioactive carbon-14 starts to decay away. It's trying to become stable, so it decays away to do that. So we can think of this like if an organism died yesterday, it will still have high levels of carbon-14 in its body, but if it died tens of thousands of years ago, it won't. And so we know the half-life of carbon-14 is around 5,730 years old. So that means after that period of time, half of the carbon-14 has decayed away. In the case of rock art dating, if the tree or animal is then burnt and turned into charcoal, and that charcoal is then used to draw on a cave wall, like this quite famous example from Chevet Cave in France, we can sample that charcoal directly. So we can take a sample, or researchers in France can take a sample of that drawing, and they can date that directly, and we can measure the amount of carbon-14 that's left in that sample versus the stable amounts of carbon-12, and that will help us to work out when the tree died, and it's likely that that was pretty close to the time that the painting was done. There is some discrepancy there, but on the timescales that we're talking about, not much. And so by sampling the art directly, the oldest painting in Chevet Cave has been radiocarbon dated to 36,500 years old. And it's radiocarbon dating, as I mentioned, that's been used in the Kimberley to generate the first published dates on some of the rock art in the region. But you can see from these 2 images here that the rock art in the Kimberley looks very different to the rock art in Chevet Cave. And that's because it's largely ochre based. Very rarely is charcoal used in rock art in the Kimberley, particularly for the older style, or what we think to be the older styles of art. And so the ochre is that reddy brown characteristic colour that we see in lots of paintings across Australia. And although it looks beautiful, unfortunately, it can't be dated. It doesn't contain enough carbon for radiocarbon dating, and we don't have any scientific techniques that currently work to date the art directly. So instead, we have to use what we call rock art associated materials. So these are basically datable materials that are either over the top of the painting or underneath the painting. And if they're over the painting, we know that the painting must be older. And if they're under the painting, we know that the painting must be younger. So we can provide those brackets. And so here's an example of a rock art associated material. This is a wasp nest covering the edge of a painted human figure. You can see it's somebody with a long headdress and these things on their shoulders there, and the nest is just over the top of one of those decorations. This sample was found high up on this rock ledge overlooking the Drysdale River in the Kimberley, and that's Damien and I collecting that very sample back in 2015. But you might be thinking, well, it doesn't look very much like a wasp nest, and how can a wasp nest be dated? What's the carbon in a wasp nest? So if we imagine we are 16,000 years in the past and a mud wasp builds a nest on the wall over the top of a painting, the nest would have looked a bit like this on the right-hand side. I'm going to commit the ultimate sin and start a video, I hope, or maybe I won't. I don't think it's going to play. Anyway, you can imagine that the wasp collects, oh, it is going to play, here we go. Just keeping me on my toes. So it's potentially covering a lot more of the painting than we see today. So it was quite large, it's about fist size. And this was a modern nest that was built and collected, much to the dismay of the poor wasp who built it, back in our field trip season in 2017. But nests 16,000 or 20,000 years ago probably looked very similar to this. And so this is a video of Damien, that Damien recorded showing a wasp collecting up that mud and carrying it in the sunlight. So you'll remember how that worked for the OSL technique, resetting those sand grains back to zero, but we can also apply the radiocarbon technique to these wasp nests as well. The wasp then carries this material back to its to the site where it's building its nest, which hopefully is over the top of a painting. And it builds the nest with these cells, and you can see that in the central 5 cells there, the wasp has laid its eggs and filled them with little baby wasps. And in the outer 2 cells, the wasp has furnished the nest with poor paralyzed spiders in this case, but in the video there you can see that the wasp is actually filling the nest with paralyzed caterpillars. So lots of organic material goes into the building of these nests when they're first made. Now, if we fast forward to today, you can see how those cell walls that we see in a modern nest look after 16,000 years of weathering. So let's just zoom in here. So this is what's left behind, these little nest stumps that retain that oval cell shape that we call a fossilized nest. So there's the modern nest, just to remind you what we're talking about. And there's various sources of carbon in these wasp nests. So if we look at it under the microscope, if we break that modern nest down, we can see that the modern nest is made up of mainly sand, but also some small black specks of charcoal, some plant material, the exoskeletons of those insects that we saw in there. But in his research, Damien found that it's actually only the charcoal that survives on the timescales that we're talking about. So all of this stuff that you can see on the screen is from a modern nest. If we collect one of the fossilized nests, it's just the charcoal that remains. And that's the material that Damien's applying radiocarbon dating to. It's a particularly challenging application of the technique because Damien's had to develop new methods to facilitate the measurement of tiny, tiny amounts of carbon that are left in those nests after tens of thousands of years, much smaller than what's measured by conventional radiocarbon measurements. And so on this particular panel, it's actually this nest that's been radiocarbon dated. You can see there's a few examples of nests all over the rock surface, but it's this one that's been dated to give us an idea of how old this painting is. And as the nest was over art, it provided a minimum median age of 16,620 years old. And so we know that because the painting is underneath that nest, the painting must be older than that. However, this is actually a little bit of an outlier in a much larger sample set focused on this particular style of art in the Kimberley. So this style of art is known in some areas of the Kimberley, its Aboriginal name is Guyon paintings. And it's dominated by these finely painted human figures, and they're often seen in elaborate ceremonial dress. So you can see they've got long headdresses, they're holding boomerangs or spears. And so 24 mud wasp nests were collected either over the top or underneath 21 paintings of this style from sites that were up to 100 kilometers apart. So here we can see examples of nests which were collected over the art. So they're illustrated there in blue in the little cartoons. And these provide us with those minimum ages that tell us that the art must be older than the age that we get for the nest. We also got a number of samples that were under the art, and these are illustrated here in orange, and they tell us that the art must be younger than the age that we get for the nest. And so using all of these results together, we can say that this style of painting was produced in a relatively narrow time period around 12,000 years ago. There are obviously some outliers that are older or younger, but most of these paintings were done at around 12,000 years. And so here's where that site that Damien and I were working on is located, in the Drysdale River National Park in the northeast Kimberley on Ballingarra land. And this is where we've done most of our field work over the last 6 years. We've been fortunate enough to go up to the Kimberley each dry season and fly around in a helicopter and camp out under the stars, collecting samples from rock art sites to bring back to the labs for analysis. Importantly, Australian rock art is unique in that the ancestors of those who created these magnificent works of art are still present on country, making this the oldest ongoing culture in the world. And we've worked closely with community members and traditional owners from the communities of Kangaroo and Wyndham in the Kimberley, including Augie Unhango, Ian Wayner and Ambrose Chalaramiri. And our project also partners with Ballingarra Aboriginal Corporation, and the Ballingarra Rangers have also joined a number of art field camps. So it's a really close collaboration, which has been fantastic over the last 6 years. It's also very important for me to say at this stage that each and every sample that's collected as a part of our research is taken with permission from a traditional owner that is present on site with us. Australian rock art is also unique in that the different art styles are often overlaid on top of one another. So you can see on this panel here, there's numerous different styles of art that are all overlaid on top of one another. And this stylistic sequence is thought to extend from present day all the way through to the last ice age. Using field observations and the work of many researchers and rock art enthusiasts who came before us, the rock art in the Kimberley can be split into these different groups. And this is based on what the paintings are showing, what colour they are, the things that are being painted. And we've given these styles names. These aren't their Aboriginal names. These are the names that we've given to these styles to help us when we're sampling or dating the materials associated. And so by looking at those panels like this one, where there's multiple styles painted on top of each other, a relative sequence has been proposed. We can hypothesize which appear to be the oldest, which are at the bottom, and which appear to be the youngest. And using this sequence, Wandjina paintings are the youngest in the sequence, and we know that those relate to culture today. Whilst irregular infill animal paintings, which is the kangaroo painting we saw at the beginning of the presentation, are usually seen at the bottom of any sequence of paintings. So we expect those to be the oldest. And so we now know where the Guion style fits into that larger sequence, somewhere in the middle at around 12,000 years. But what about that kangaroo? Well, as a result of the rock art dating project, as we know, this painting of a kangaroo is now the oldest known in situ painted art in Australia. The reason this painting is particularly faded or a little bit difficult to make out is that it seems to be a favourite spot for wasps to build their nests thousands of years ago. Much to Damien's delight, it was absolutely covered with hundreds and hundreds of fossilised mud wasp nest stumps. Damien carefully sampled 3 nests which were over the top of the painting and 3 nests which were underneath the painting in the hope that we would be able to create a bracket for when that painting was done. The age of the oldest overart nest suggests that this kangaroo is older than around 17,200 years, and the age of the youngest underart nest suggests that the painting must be younger than around 17,500 years. This means that we can give the motif a median age or a value of 17,300 years, making it Australia's oldest in situ rock art. And so it's located here, again, on the Drysdale River on Balangara country. And we use that term in situ rock art because there has been other evidence of older rock art dated elsewhere. A buried rock with two intersecting black lines was found here in West Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. And it was found during an archaeological dig. It wasn't on the wall of the shelter, it had fallen off and was found when archaeologists were doing a dig at that site. It was indirectly radiocarbon dated using ash that was stuck to its surface and also based on its position in the dig to 28,000 years. Similarly, in the Kimberley, a painted slab, presumably also fallen from a rock shelter wall and found in an archaeological dig, was dated to 40,000 years by a group led by Sue O'Connor back in 2001. So whilst our findings are hugely exciting, it's highly unlikely that the Kangaroo painting is the oldest surviving painted rock art in the Kimberley, and future research will almost certainly locate even older artworks, which might be encroaching more on those ages that we've seen in Indonesia and Europe. But what's really important is that we now know where this art fits into the larger sequence, as well as how it relates to what was happening in the Kimberley at this time. We can see that the art seems to change during the sequence, that people change the things that they like to paint. You can see that people are changing what they're wearing, what they're doing. And we're interested in why this is. Can it tell us about how climate change and sea levels affected life in the Kimberley? And can it tell us things about how people lived or what they cared about or how they related to the landscape that they were living in? We now know using these dates where the two art styles, the irregular infill animal and the Goyon, fit within the large-scale climatic and environmental changes, such as the last ice age around 21,000 years ago, and very rapid sea level rises that occurred about 14,500 years ago. Perhaps these events were enough to change what people were interested in painting, and they stopped painting the large-scale kangaroos and they started painting human figures with the headdresses and the boomerangs. And so this is an active scientific investigation. We're far from finished, and although the findings so far are really exciting, many more dates using that whole range of different techniques on different materials are required to help us better understand when each of these art periods began and when they ended, and how the Kimberley rock art fits into the timeline of rock art which has been dated across the world. And so it's a really big job, and it's very much a work in progress, and it involves a huge team of people who I feel very fortunate to work alongside, and I look forward to continuing research, rock art research in the Kimberley once we can safely do so again. And thank you very much for listening. I hope to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was incredible and a great overview, and just the time scales of what you work in is always so surprising to me whenever I hear about geologists and earth scientists in general. It's just some incredible work, so thank you so much. We have a number of questions already coming in. We've got only maybe 5 or 6 minutes, so we'll try and get to a number of them, but we've got some sort of overall sort of questions about your work, some more specific science questions, I guess more specific detail, I guess, from the work that you're doing. And what about the animations of your presentation? So we might get to that one at the end if we can. I'm going to start off with one from Diane Martin, who looks like they've got, is a teacher, and their students are in the session as well, which is lovely. So we've got a few Diane Martin fans. But Diane's asking us a bit more, I guess, overall about your research and I guess the things that you are working on. So you mentioned about the collecting, but I guess the other things that you do as a you know, an academic in this field, you know, the specific work that you do, and also maybe some setbacks and what are the woohoo moments is what Diane said as well. It's a bigger question to start off with, but I guess it's an overall about the work that you do in this area.
Yeah, look, I think working in the Kimberley has a whole heap of woohoo moments. It's an amazing place to work, and you're working with really cool stuff, but it's also really difficult. And there's a reason why the Kimberley rock art hasn't been dated until relatively recently, or not, at least not to the scale that we're doing so in our project. And that's because we're working with very tiny samples, both through necessity of what's available and also because we don't want to take big samples from these rock art sites. We take the very minimal samples that we can use in the lab so that we don't impact the art. And so that's a real challenge. You know, we're applying techniques to new materials that haven't had these techniques applied to them before, and sometimes it doesn't work. Uranium thorium is really my specialty, which I talked about at the beginning, and applying that to calcite or to stalagmites in caves, which is what I did during my PhD, is relatively straightforward. Not to you know, put anything on those researchers in Europe and Indonesia where they're doing that, but in the Kimberley we don't have calcite, so it's very, very difficult. We're applying this technique to new minerals and trying to figure out how that can work and how we can get reliable results. So whilst when we celebrate the wins when we get them, and you know, the work that Damien's done on dating the wasp nests is amazing, and it's so exciting. There has been lots of instances where we've tried to date things and it hasn't worked, and that's why we need so many samples, and we need to just keep trying. And we're very, very fortunate that we've had a long research project. We've been doing this now for 6 years, and we've got another couple of years to go, which gives us the time that we need to develop the techniques as they need to be developed.
Incredible. So there was a question about the wasp nests, and I guess well, Priscilla asked, why do wasp nests like, well, why do wasps like to build nests on the artwork? But I think the overall question is why it was sort of used, and I think why was that decided upon as a great dating technique to use?
I think, again, through necessity, that rock art in the Kimberley is very difficult to date because it's not carbon and there isn't any calcite. It's not a limestone environment. In limestone environments, we get the calcite that's been used to date those oldest examples of rock art in the world. And then in places like France, in Chauvet Cave, the art has been done with charcoal, so you can directly date it. But in the Kimberley, we were really looking for what can we date. We can't date the pigment, we can't date calcite, so what things are there? And when you go to the Kimberley and look at a shelter, I don't think it's so much that the wasps are choosing to paint, to build their nests on top of the art. It's just there's so many of them, and they build them all over these rock shelters that every now and again, if you're lucky and you do enough field work, you find nests that are either over or under the painting, and you can use those to bracket the age of the art.
Yeah, no, very lucky to have so many of them. You did mention the calcite, and so it not being in the mineral accretion in the rocks that you do date. So what are the minerals there? Are you aware of, like, what else is in there?
We've spent a long time characterizing the mineral accretion. So there's still these big mineral crusts that are forming from water flowing over the shelter surfaces, but because it's not a limestone environment, it's sandstone in the Kimberley. The minerals that we have are phosphates, sulfates, oxalates. Luckily, oxalates can be radiocarbon dated, so there is an option to apply radiocarbon dating to those mineral accretions as well to work out how old they are, but there isn't any calcite. So in terms of applying uranium series dating, we are trying to do that, but we're applying it to the phosphate minerals that we see. The mineral accretions have these nice layers, which makes that a little bit easier because we can produce these sequence stages and check that the technique is reliable. But yeah, it's the phosphates that we're looking at for uranium series.
Yeah. I've got one question from Kerry. So how are the names for the different periods determined?
Yeah, that's a good question. The names that I gave in my presentation are names that have either been generated by our project or by previous rock art researchers. It's important to note that they aren't their Aboriginal names. We use those names to help us to understand what we're dating and to fit that into the research project that we're working on. And we would use the Aboriginal names if it wasn't for the fact that they have different names depending on the different communities and the different language groups. So it's not appropriate to choose one name and apply that to the style. It's better for us to just use our own names so we know what we're talking about, but to the wider Kimberley, the styles have different names depending on where the people come from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, just to mix things up, I'm going to ask one question from Anonymous. They were very impressed with the animations, as was I, to be honest. Well, how did you make the animations in your presentation today?
Well, I think I mentioned to you, Julia, at the beginning that I've just got a brand new computer, and so I used Keynote, but I was very keen to use all my fancy new, new computer, a new big screen to make the animation. So Keynote would be my recommendation. So much better than PowerPoint. Okay, all right, there you go. There you go, everyone. Here's the tip. Now,
now. What else is one? Oh, yes, one from Emily. Can you explain how this art, if you know, is being preserved for future generations, being out in the field and being close to that art?
Yeah, I think it's again a sort of unique aspect of the Kimberley itself, a combination of different things. So it's sandstone surfaces that are being painted, and it's always on the sandstone, particular types of the sandstone that we find the best preserved art. And if you think about the art, it's a bit like a tattoo on the rock surface. It's almost like it's soaked into the grains of the sandstone. And I think that's really helped to preserve, because obviously in the Kimberley, there's monsoons, there's really quite extreme weather. And we're not talking about caves that are underground like we find in Europe. They're actually just sitting out in the open. So you would think that it wouldn't last a very long time at all. But I think it's some sort of unique combination of the material that's been used, the ochre, and how that's soaked into the sandstone pore spaces, and it's really clung on to the art and preserved it like that.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's very, I mean, I guess amazing for us all to still be able to see it there from something that's been there for so many thousands of years. So yeah. It's incredible. So we're rapidly running out of time and 2 minutes over already. So I'll just finish off with one final question about sort of, I guess, your next steps in the work that you're doing and what's coming up for you.
Yeah, well, we still have a couple of years of the rock art dating project left. Unfortunately, like everybody, I know you said this is a COVID-free zone, so I won't dwell on that. But we haven't been able to go to the Kimberley for the last couple of years. We haven't been able to go up there to collect any more samples. So at the moment, we're working through. Luckily for us, we've had a lot of field seasons since 2015, and we've collected a lot of samples. So we've spent the last couple of years working through those, and we're hopeful that next year we'll be able to go up and go to new sites and collect more samples and do more dating so that we can bracket those styles more accurately and just build on that picture of the stylistic sequence and where it fits into the wider scale of things. So more field work and more lab work, basically. Just more dates we get, the better the picture is. Yeah, incredible. All right, well, I'm really interested to see where all this goes and to hear about more of the timescales and the specific dates that you found around these artworks. I guess we're all aware of that these amazing paintings that are very, very old, but to have a specific age on them is just makes it even more incredible. So thank you so much. Amazing presentation. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone out there in Zoom land also for tuning in. There's a few things just to mention before we head off. So obviously today is just the first of a whole series of mid-afternoon masterclasses, and tomorrow we have Dr. Stuart Johnson. He'll be coming in and we'll be talking about some mathematical modelling, specifically about understanding how human activity affects whale migration. So whole nother topic, a whole nother area, but it's going to be just as fascinating. And also as well, we've still got lots and lots of Science Festival events happening all week. There's one happening at 3 o'clock as well. If you feel like still another event, you've got time to grab a quick cuppa and then head back into the Zoom. And the next one is glow in the dark, so using fluorescence to observe DNA in a living cell. So if you head over to the Science Festival website, you'll be able to get the link for that. So they're the main things. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Helen, for your wonderful presentation. Have a lovely rest of the week. And happy Science Festival and happy National Science Week to everyone. Have a good afternoon.